Today, 3 Muslim terrorists attacked a satirical newspaper in the heart of Paris, shouting Allah Akbar, the Arabic phrase saying Allah is great. They attacked in a military style with precision and timing and skill. They had it planned. They forced an employee to give them access to the secret passcode to open the lock. They knew there were police out front and assassinated them. Look at that degree of precision in the shooting there. That's not someone using a gun for the first time. These were seasoned terrorists, perhaps of the sort who had training overseas. Perhaps they were even veterans of the Islamic State. These were no lone wolves. There were no random crazies here. Those excuses are always the first refuge of politically correct journalists and politicians. For psychological and political reasons, their first instinct is always to deny that Muslim terrorism is either Muslim or terrorism. That's tough to do here. And in fact, both France's president and Barack Obama described the attack as terrorism in their first public statements. 12 people are dead. One report says the terrorists asked for specific editors and cartoonists by name in perfect French, and that they shouted that this was vengeance for Allah, a clear reference to the magazine's satire of Islam. But that's the thing about the magazine, named Charlie Hebdo. It's not an anti-Muslim magazine, as some politically correct apologists have said. It's an anti-everything magazine. It mocks Christians. It mocks Jews. It mocks Muslims. It mocks people who mock Muslims. I mean, in fact, this latest cover story was mocking a French author who had just written a novel about France in the future ruled by a Muslim president. It's an equal opportunity satirical magazine, but that's the thing, isn't it? You can mock Christians and nothing happens. Mock Jews, same thing. Mock Hindus, mock Sikhs, mock Buddhists, mock just about anyone. And the most that'll happen is they'll send you a firm letter to the editor. But mock Muslims, and you could get murdered. This isn't the first time Charlie Hebdo was attacked. A few years back, it was bombed. Police stepped up security, but it obviously wasn't enough. Charlie Hebdo published cartoons mocking Mohammed going back years, going back to 2006. Shortly after, the Danish newspaper, the Jyllands-Posten, published a dozen cartoons of Mohammed that led to death threats, assassination attempts, and international boycotts against Denmark itself, and violent riots around the world that murdered more than 200 people. Here, for the next 2 minutes, I want to show you the cartoons, because I bet you haven't seen them before. Because not a single other newspaper of record in Canada, or TV station in Canada, or magazine in Canada published the Danish cartoons. Back in 2006, even though it was surely the largest news story of the season back then, they all self-censored. Not Charlie Hebdo and the Jyllands-Posten and a handful of newspapers around the world, but all the great newspapers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, all the big ones, the brave ones, all the TV stations, CBS, NBC, ABC, in Canada, CTV, Global, CBC, all of them declined to show those cartoons, which did 3 things. Show them again while I'm talking. 3 things that in fact led in their own way today's murder. I mean, the first thing that happened by not publishing these cartoons when they were legitimate news, when they were the central artifact of the largest news story of the day, the first thing that happened was that these cartoons were given a mystical, cosmic reputation. I mean, what crap doesn't the media show on TV? Have you watched Game of Thrones? Is there any act of obscenity or violence or sexuality the media doesn't shovel at us daily? So how terrifying and terrible and insulting these cartoons must be for the CBC not to show them to us, for the National Post or the Globe and Mail not to show them to us. I mean, they'll show us anything. It was the cowardly, politically correct decision not to show the cartoons that imbued them with that power, such that terrorists are still motivated to kill for them, and that most Canadians and Americans who have never seen these cartoons because of media self-censorship could probably have concluded, well, they must be awful cartoons. So by not publishing the cartoons, they were made powerful. The second thing is to publish them would be to show how thin-skinned and hypersensitive and irrational radical Islam really is. I mean, seriously, you're rioting over this? It's a guy in the desert. Here's a cartoon where the cartoonist mocks himself, showing how afraid he was to draw Mohammed. You're rioting over this? Well, yes, because it's just a pretext. I mean, terrorists don't need an excuse to terrify. Radical Islam doesn't need a trigger to attack. It's embedded in its jihadist nature. That's what jihad means, a holy war against infidels. The jihad is permanent, perpetual. The cartoons were merely the excuse of the day. that we gave them by making them exotic instead of showing how banal they are. And the third point, because only a handful of media showed the cartoons, the Jyllands-Posten in Denmark, Charlie Hebdo in Paris. In Canada, only my little magazine at the time, the Western Standard. It was only a handful of independent-minded journalists who showed the cartoons, those few became targets. Imagine if every single newspaper and TV station in the West had all shown the cartoons together, not as an expression of their own opinion, but as an exhibit to a news story, like a photo of an earthquake. You're not endorsing the earthquake, you're showing it, you're reporting it. Imagine if every news medium in the West had shown the cartoons, not just a few. Then it would have been the entire West, not only rebuking radical Islam, but making an impossible target, the entire West itself. It would have been like Kirk Douglas's film, Spartacus.
Slaves you were, and slaves you remain. But the terrible penalty of crucifixion has been set aside on the single condition that you identify the body or the living person of the slave called Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
Yeah, it didn't happen, did it? Today, after the terrorist mass murder at Charlie Hebdo in Paris, some Western journalists are acting very butch and very I'm Spartacus by tweeting the words "Je suis Charlie" on Twitter, or even making it their Twitter avatar, the little symbol they use online for Twitter. I am Charlie Hebdo. Well, no, you're not. You're not Charlie Hebdo, are you? Because Charlie Hebdo had the courage to publish cartoons that offended radical Muslims. You don't. You have the fake courage, the coward's placebo of saying, oh yeah, I'm with him, I'm with the brave guy, instead of actually making your Twitter symbol a cartoon of Mohammed itself. Now that would be an act of courage, a micro act of courage, but at least it would be something. How many journalists in Canada and the United States and across the West, including in France, were all butch and brave just 2 weeks ago when Sony Pictures announced that it wasn't going to release its movie about North Korea called The Interview to theaters because of threats? Oh, journalists were so brave then, weren't they? Again, brave observers. They knew they themselves would never be challenged to do anything. Only Sony itself could release the film. But tonight on TV and in tomorrow's newspapers and in real time right now on Twitter, thousands of those same journalists have the chance to show their courage and solidarity and their own independent-mindedness. And of course, they're not. Because if I told you a dozen times before, journalists are not courageous. They are not rebels or dissidents. They are most certainly not politically incorrect. They are, by nature, lurkers, creepers, voyeurs, sitting in the bleachers, a peanut gallery, commenting on those few people actually in the arena. Oh, journalists love the blood and the gore and the shock and the horror of the war on terror. When it's someone else in the arena, someone else being murdered by Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, then journalists are most gleeful. But here it's journalists in Paris themselves being targeted, and so journalists everywhere are now terrified, as they should be. Terrorism is terrifying, but courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the proper management of fear, the proper prioritization of fear. If you are too afraid to publish freely, fine, then say so. Admit it. Don't be pretend brave and then run your magazine or TV station as if you're already under Sharia law. One of the great newspapers of the United Kingdom, called the Daily Telegraph, they've already succumbed. They literally blurred, they pixelated a picture, blurred it out of a cartoon of Mohammed. Seriously, they are now treating Mohammed, a historical figure, a religious figure, like Jesus or Moses. They're treating it as something they cannot and will not depict out of fear. It's not out of respect. Journalists do not respect Islam. Most journalists don't respect any religion. But in this case, it's fear, because Christians and Jews and Amish and Hindus and Quakers don't storm newspaper offices, SWAT team style, and hunt down editors as a vengeance for what was published 9 years ago. Because they mean it. These terrorists. You've probably seen this picture before. Well, let me take that back. You probably haven't, because journalists who are afraid of Islam probably haven't shown this picture to you. They're the real Islamophobes, you know, people afraid of Islam, Islamophobia, or at least afraid of radical Islam, afraid to criticize it, afraid to talk about it, afraid to even mention its name sometimes. The CBC is the worst, by far. They actually have a long-standing policy not to even use the word terrorist. They literally have a policy on their website, look it up, banning that word unless the CBC reporter is just quoting someone else saying the word terrorism. They prefer militant because they say to say terrorist is to take sides, and that would offend Muslim terrorists. That's their long-standing policy, but they actually issued a new fatwa today. Get this, let me quote it. We aren't showing cartoons making fun of the Prophet Muhammad. Other elements of Charles Hebdo's content and style are fine, but this area should be avoided as, quite simply, it's offensive to Muslims as a group. And he went on to say, we wouldn't have published these images before today, not out of fear, but out of respect for the beliefs and sensibilities of the mass of Muslim believers. Why would the actions of a gang of violent thugs force us to change that position? This isn't the time for emotional responses or bravado. There are better ways to honor and stand beside our fellow journalists. So in other words, the CBC is saying, we will not insult people who are easily riled up. We will not show you the news. We can see it. We're grown up enough to see it, but you, viewer, are not. You know, I noticed something else today. The CBC has started to refer to Muhammad as the Prophet Muhammad, not the Muslim Prophet Muhammad or Islam's Prophet Muhammad, but the Prophet Muhammad. Do you think it would be a bit weird if the CBC started saying, our Lord Jesus Christ? Oh, a bit, don't you think? But they don't say that because they're not afraid of terrorists hacking off their heads or shooting them for disrespecting Jesus. It's not respect of Islam, it's fear. But you better say the Prophet Muhammad, and you'd better not say the word terrorist if you're at the CBC. But back to this picture I showed you a moment ago. It's a picture taken in the streets of London, but we've seen similar rallies across the West. We hear it all the time. Behead those who insult Islam. The thing is, they mean it. They really, really mean it. Maybe not every single person holding up a sign means it or will do it, but all it takes is one or two or three who do. That's what terrorism is. That's the source of Islamophobia. Our fear of Islam is that they'll do it. Of course, most Muslims are not terrorists. Most do not want to live in a medieval theocracy, a violent dictatorship. That's why so many Muslims immigrate to the West to get away from Sharia countries. Some of the best liberal Democrats I know are Muslims, refugees in a way, not formal refugees necessarily, but those who have sought out Canada specifically to get away from Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, like our dear friends Raheel Raza and Tariq Fada have done. They're not scary. But what about the percentage of Muslims who do cause the Islamophobia, the ones who hold up such signs pledging violence? And it's not just journalists who are cowards. What do you do when the leader of the free world himself condemns insulting Islam?
The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam.
That was him at the United Nations. Obama condemned an American filmmaker for lawfully making a YouTube video that was critical of Islam. It wasn't just Obama, his whole administration condemned it and blamed that YouTube video for violence in Benghazi, Libya. Now, that was a campaign lie to hide the fact that it was an al-Qaeda attack in Libya, but put that aside. The Obama administration was effectively saying, if you insult Muslims, they will be violent. Cause and effect. It's effectively blaming people who use free speech for the violence against them and saying, oh, Muslims, what can you do? They're violent people. Same argument the CBC made, blaming the victim. Look at this.
I also want to take a moment to address the video circulating on the internet that has led to these protests.
Well, it is in response to a video.
It began spontaneously in Benghazi, sparked by this hateful video.
It was a crude and disgusting video, sparked outrage throughout the Muslim world. There's no video that justifies an attack on an embassy.
There's two things there. One is blaming the victim. We'd better not do anything provocative. That's the CBC excuse. But the other is the soft bigotry of low expectations. Oh, they're Muslims. What are you going to do? You say something, they're going to get violent. That's bigotry too. And that's another thing. Terrorists don't need an excuse to terrorize. They're not looking for an excuse. They tell you their rationale in advance. They're doing this for the jihad because you are an infidel. We don't need to offer them up some new rationale that they don't claim for themselves. We don't need to blame the victim, to blame the use of free speech for the violence against us. It's like blaming a woman for wearing a skirt for provoking a serial rapist. So what should we do? Well, after the break, I'll start off by telling you what we all did wrong in 2006 after the first cartoon murders. Don't go away. So there I was back in 2006, the publisher of a small magazine called The Western Standard, and we ran the biggest news story of the season, the Danish cartoons and the riots by Muslim extremists. And I was immediately prosecuted by the Alberta Human Rights Commission for 900 days. I actually received no serious threats of violence. Canada isn't like France, not yet at least. But in the place of the mob violence, the terrorist violence, the Alberta government stepped in to censor me by prosecuting me for hate speech under the province's Human Rights Code and their censorship provision. It was a secular government enforcing a Sharia law edict. It was a disgrace. And where were Canada's journalists then? There was no murder like there was today in Paris. There was no imminent threat, no violence, but the cowardice was shocking nonetheless. As I've said before, no other media of record published the cartoons, but it was worse than that. The official journalists' freedom group called Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, the folks you'd expect to support the publication of the cartoons, they went totally silent. For 3 months, they hid under their desks. And when they finally came out after the whole kerfuffle was over, what did they do? They had a panel discussion with 2 people for censorship and 2 against it. They couldn't even bring themselves to oppose censorship and support, what's their name again? Right, free expression. How about Amnesty International? The group founded to fight against fascism and authoritarianism. Well, they were even worse. Amnesty International literally published a document demanding that Western journalists restrain themselves. I'm serious. They sided, at least in part, with the rioters. Let me quote from their official release. Quote, AI, Amnesty International, also calls on those working in the media to act with sensitivity and responsibility so as not to exacerbate the current situation. This incident highlights the power and reach of the media, and AI calls on those in the media to apply greater political judgment, taking into account the potential impact of their output and the range of often competing human rights considerations involved. Competing human rights considerations. So you journalists, you balance your freedom of religion, your freedom of speech, freedom of the press, you balance that, those real rights, balance that with the counterfeit rights not to be offended. That's Amnesty International. In other words, terrorism works. It terrifies people into submission. Why did Al-Qaeda, that's who these terrorists said they were, why would Al-Qaeda attack a newspaper instead of a soldier or a parliament or a military base or something more deadly? Why didn't they go for a mass shooting of a public venue? Why didn't they blow up trains or subways? I mean, they went for a target that had locks and security and 2 cops on guard. Why did Al-Qaeda do that? Because they know the Western media very well. They know how cowardly it is. They know that journalists who are so brave when dishing it out run and hide under their desks at the first whiff of gunpowder. You can see it already, from the Telegraph in the UK blurring images to the false bravado of the Je suis Charlie avatars that journalists have. They're scared. You'll see it tonight on other TV stations and tomorrow in the country's newspapers. Do you really think the Globe and Mail or the Post or the Toronto Star or the CBC will show the pictures that I've shown you today? That's just tomorrow after the break. I'll tell you how the terrorists are controlling the media coverage for more than just the immediate future. They're conquering the minds of journalists for years to come. Stay with us. So there's an attack in France. 10 journalists and 2 police officers shot dead by Muslim terrorists shouting Allah Akbar. So how will this change how the media covers terrorism? What about a week from now, a month from now? Journalists know that Al-Qaeda is patient. These murders were 9 years after the first Danish cartoons were published. Salman Rushdie published his book, The Satanic Verses, in the 1980s. And he's been under an Iranian fatwa ever since, and security ever since, too. I don't know if he'll die a natural death. The Danish cartoonists themselves have constant threats and attempts on their lives. In a month's time, if a story about Islam comes up, how many journalists, editors, producers, anchors, talk show hosts will say, you know what? Let's drop the Muslim story. Yeah, too much risk. We're a business. Let's do some risk management here. Let's talk about hockey instead, or run a cute kitten video, or that crazy weather. Let's avoid using the word terrorist. Let's say militant. Better yet, let's just not talk about it at all. And if someone else has the temerity to talk about radical Islam and terrorism, let's make it really, really clear that we're not them. That if there's going to be a bombing or shooting or vengeance, that's the newspaper and TV station down the street, guys. That's not us. Do you doubt that, whether it's conscious or subconscious, thousands of journalists will now tailor their reporting to be less provocative of the religion of peace? And that's just journalists. What about politicians who had the wits scared out of them on Parliament Hill last October by a gunman? What about judges and human rights commissions? They'll be more censorious than ever. I mean, better shut down any troublemakers, better shut down any Islamophobes, anyone who expresses their fear about radical Islam. Better shut them down for the public good and, hey, for their own good too. I put it to you that this terror attack today that killed 12 people, 10 journalists and 2 cops, did more damage to our Western culture of liberty than did 9/11 itself. 9/11 was atrocious, monstrous, 3,000 people murdered. But if anything, it caused increased resolve in the West, at least for a few years. Other than some ridiculous new rules at airports, it didn't actually diminish our culture of liberty. In fact, it made the West resolve. But what about this attack against the dealers of ideas, the intermediaries of political and cultural debates? Didn't 1,000 journalists today just say, I better watch my step, I better pull my punches? That's terrorism. It terrifies people into changing their conduct to appease the terrorists. Attack a military base, they'll shoot back. Murder cartoonists, and the surviving cartoonists will choose to draw something else. I was asked by Maclean's magazine today, what should the government of France do? Well, I don't know, deport foreign radicals who espouse the jihad, prosecute citizens who promote violence. I think they're probably doing those things, but that's not the right question. This isn't a military fight. It's a civilian fight, a civic fight, a cultural fight. The real question is, what should the rest of us do, starting with journalists, but also judges and politicians and police? What should we all do? I know what the answer to that is. We should not be terrified. We should not cower in terror. We should all defy the Muslim extremists together. We should all do exactly what they don't want us to do. We should all be Spartacus, not just by saying, Je suis Charlie, but by living our lives like Charlie did, unafraid and with utter contempt for radical Islam, not fake respect and submission to it out of Islamophobia, out of fear.